I still remember the chill that morning carried when I made the decision to step into a life that felt far bigger than me. I had been on edge all night, pacing my tiny apartment, wondering if I had finally reached the moment when things could change or fall apart completely. My phone call with Jonathan Reeves had been brief, almost clinical. 3 months. No days off. You'll live on the estate and care for my daughter full time. We'll handle everything else. His voice was deep, steady, but there was something behind it, a weight that no wealth could erase. He had said my pay would equal a year of work anywhere else. And for someone like me, that wasn't just an offer. It was survival. My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 29 years old, a licensed child therapist specializing in autism spectrum disorders. On paper, that sounds stable, maybe even admirable. But the truth? My life had felt anything but stable. I grew up in the system, shuffled between foster homes after my parents died in a car accident when I was 9. The kind of childhood where birthdays were just another day, where trust was something you built alone because no one stayed long enough to earn it. I learned early on to be self-reliant, to protect myself from disappointments by keeping people at a safe distance. Maybe that's why I buried myself in books, in psychology, in the science of why people hurt and how they heal. I graduated top of my class at Boston University, determined to make something of my life, to prove I wasn't just another foster kid who disappeared into the cracks of the system. But the world has a way of testing people like me. My first job ended when my supervisor accidentally brushed my shoulder one too many times, then called me too sensitive when I reported him. My second position collapsed when I was accused, falsely, of stealing prescription medication from a clinic supply room. Rumors spread fast in healthcare. And the third? The third ended because I simply burned out working 12-hour shifts with violent patients while my own anxiety chewed me alive from the inside. Somewhere along the way, I stopped wearing makeup, stopped doing my hair, stopped wearing anything form-fitting. It was easier to disappear, to be invisible, than to keep dealing with unwanted attention or false assumptions about why I was there. People don't realize how exhausting it is to be judged before you even open your mouth. So I hid behind baggy sweaters, tied back hair, thick glasses I didn't even need. And then the call came. Jonathan Reeves, a name I only vaguely recognized from financial news, a widowed millionaire who had made his fortune in high-risk investments. I remember clutching the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white as he outlined the job. Caring for his 16-year-old daughter, Sophie, who had a rare autoimmune condition and Asperger's syndrome. He needed someone who understood both the physical and emotional toll of chronic illness, someone who wouldn't flinch at meltdowns, silence, or the occasional storm of emotions that neurotypical people often don't understand. Why me? I asked him quietly, because after so many rejections, after so many false starts, it was hard to believe anyone would choose me. There was a pause on the line, a breath that almost sounded like hesitation. Because your former professor recommended you. He said you care, and you don't quit when it gets hard. That's exactly what Sophie needs. That sentence lodged itself deep in me. You don't quit when it gets hard. It had been years since anyone said something that felt like belief, like trust. For a moment, I almost wanted to cry, but I bit down on it, as I always did, and said, I'll take it. The days leading up to my departure blurred into frantic preparation. I packed my life into one suitcase, a couple of jeans, soft sweaters, and a pair of winter boots already showing signs of wear. Vermont in late autumn was no joke, and Jonathan's estate, according to online maps, sat on top of a hill surrounded by forest. Remote, isolated, exactly the kind of place people like me both feared and secretly craved. Because maybe, just maybe, I could finally breathe there. Still, the night before I left, doubts crawled in like cold wind through cracked windows. What if I wasn't good enough? What if Sophie hated me? What if Jonathan fired me the way others had? And underneath all of that, a quieter, more painful thought whispered, what if I fail again? But failure or not, I had no real choice. My savings were nearly gone. and the world outside wasn't offering many second chances. So I zipped my suitcase shut, took one last look at the life I was leaving behind, a small studio apartment, peeling wallpaper, and the soft hum of traffic outside, and told myself, this isn't running away. This is running toward something. The next morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, a black SUV pulled up in front of my building. A man in his mid-30s stepped out, smiling warmly. "Claire Donovan, I'm Jason Miller. I'll be your driver today." His tone was friendly, easy in a way that caught me off guard. People usually didn't smile like that at me. I handed him my single suitcase, slipped into the back seat, and watched as the cityscape dissolved into winding roads and endless trees. For 3 hours, we drove north, the world outside changing from gray concrete to rolling hills bathed in late autumn gold, then into forests beginning to bare themselves for winter. By the time we reached the long private drive, lined with maple trees that still clung to a few golden leaves, I felt like I had stepped into another life, one that felt strangely still, like holding your breath underwater. And maybe I was holding mine, because this wasn't just a job. It was a chance to start over, to stop running from my past and maybe, just maybe, find something like home. Jonathan Reeves was waiting for me when we pulled up to the estate. I hadn't expected him to meet me personally. In my head, a man like that, wealthy, powerful, too busy for anything outside boardrooms, would send an assistant or a manager. Instead, there he was at the front steps, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair just beginning to gray at the temples and eyes that carried a weight I recognized instantly, the kind that comes from loving someone you're terrified of losing. "Ms. Donovan." His voice was low and even, but his gaze searched me as if he was trying to see past the surface. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." I stepped out of the car, clutching my bag like it was armor. "Thank you for the opportunity," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My chest tightened with nerves, because this wasn't just another interview, wasn't just another chance to prove myself. It was 3 months of my life, with no way out once I said yes. Jonathan nodded toward the house. "We can talk in my study. Maggie will show you to your room after." Inside, the estate was everything I expected, and yet not. Yes, it was large, elegant, and meticulously kept, with polished wood floors and vaulted ceilings. But it didn't feel cold or sterile like most wealthy homes I'd seen. There were photographs, real, candid ones, lining the walls. A younger Jonathan holding a baby wrapped in pink, an older boy hugging what I assumed was a little sister, and a woman with a smile so warm it almost hurt to look at her. His late wife. I didn't ask questions. Some grief, you can see from a mile away. Jonathan's study was cozy despite its size. Bookshelves lined the walls, a fire burned low in the hearth, and the scent of coffee filled the air. He gestured to a leather chair, then sat across from me, his hands clasped. "I want to be clear," he began, "about what this job entails. Sophie is 16. She has a rare autoimmune disorder that makes her tired and fragile. On top of that, she's on the autism spectrum, high-functioning but very withdrawn. She doesn't connect with people easily, hasn't for years." His eyes flicked toward a photo on the desk, a girl with pale blonde hair and solemn eyes. "Your role isn't to fix her. That's not possible. Your role is to be present, to support her, and if possible, to give her moments of joy." He paused, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "We don't have many of those." I listened, nodding slowly. "What about school? Social life?" "She's homeschooled," he said. "Mostly online tutoring. She hasn't had friends for a long time. Honestly, I think she stopped trying. And I don't know how to reach her anymore." For the first time, Jonathan looked away, staring into the fire like it might hold an answer. "I've worked with children on the spectrum before," I said softly. "I can't promise miracles, Mr. Reeves, but I can promise effort." That made him look back at me. That's all I'm asking for. Effort and presence. Which brings me to the terms. You'll live here full time. No weekends off for the first 3 months, unless there's an emergency. Sophie needs consistency, someone who won't disappear. He hesitated, then added, Your compensation will reflect the sacrifice, 5 times the standard rate for full-time in-home therapy. 5 times. My heart stuttered because that was more than I'd ever earned in my life. That's generous, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Inside, though, my thoughts spun wildly. That kind of money could change everything. Wipe out my debt, give me breathing room for once, maybe even let me think about what I wanted instead of what I needed to survive. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. This isn't about generosity, Ms. Donovan. It's about Sophie. She's everything to me, and I won't apologize for wanting the best care for her. There was no arrogance in his tone, only raw sincerity and exhaustion. I'd seen that look before in foster parents who actually cared, who were scared they weren't enough. Only Jonathan had the means to do something about it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to ask the practical questions: her medical routine, allergies, behavior triggers, emergency contacts. He answered each one meticulously, clearly used to operating under pressure. The man was organized, decisive, maybe even intimidating. But there was a gentleness underneath it, too. A man desperate to hold together a life that was fraying at the edges. When we finished, he stood extending his hand. Do we have an agreement? I hesitated only long enough to take a breath. Yes, we do. He gave one sharp nod, almost a release of tension. Maggie will show you to your room. Dinner's at 6. I'll introduce you to Sophie after. And just like that, it was done. As I followed Maggie, a warm, red-haired woman with a brisk, no-nonsense energy, through the hallways to the guest wing, I felt the weight of it settling in. 3 months, no escape, but also a chance to not only rebuild my life, but maybe help a girl who had given up on people the way I once had. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than fear. I felt purpose. The guest room Maggie led me to took my breath away. It wasn't lavish in the way most people imagine a millionaire's house to be. There was no gold trim, no cold marble floors that echoed with every step. Instead, it felt lived in. The bed was neatly made with a quilt that looked hand-stitched, the kind of thing passed down from family, not bought online. A window stretched wide across one wall, overlooking acres of forest glowing amber and red, the late autumn sunlight dripping through maple branches like honey. Maggie placed my suitcase on the bed and gave me a warm smile. I'm Maggie O'Connor. Been with the family 30 years, raised my own boy here too. If you need anything at all, you come find me. Her voice carried that melodic Irish lilt, soft but steady, like someone who had seen storms and stayed rooted anyway. I smiled back, my shoulders easing a little. Thank you, Maggie. It's beautiful here. Beautiful, yes, but quiet. You'll get used to that. Supper at 6, remember. The boss doesn't like late meals. She winked before stepping out, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the unfamiliar stillness. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out at the golden trees, and let out a slow breath. It had been years since I'd felt this kind of peace, but peace had never lasted long in my life. So I wasn't sure whether to trust it. At dinner, I met the rest of the household. The dining room was large but warm, a long oak table polished to a soft shine, with simple linen napkins and fresh flowers in a vase. It didn't feel like a mansion trying to impress people. It felt like a home. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the composed businessman in his crisp shirt, though his eyes softened when Maggie placed a steaming dish of roasted chicken in front of him. To his right sat a young woman, tall, striking, with glossy dark hair and a fitted uniform dress that was probably supposed to look modest, but didn't. "This is Brittany," Jonathan said simply, as if he already knew I might sense the tension radiating off her. "She handles the upstairs rooms and some of Sophie's laundry." Brittany gave me a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "So you're the new caretaker." Her voice was sweet in the way sugar can sometimes feel sharp on your teeth. "Welcome." "Thank you," I said, trying to match her politeness. She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to her plate. Across from her sat a man who looked like he belonged outdoors. Broad shoulders, strong hands, sun-weathered skin. "Ryan O'Connor," he said with a nod, his accent faint, touched by the same Irish lilt as Maggie's. "Landscaping and maintenance." Maggie herself sat beside me, cheerful and chatty, telling stories about how Jonathan's late wife had loved planting tulips every spring, how Sophie used to toddle through the garden before her health declined. There was history here, layers of love and loss woven into every corner of this house. Jason, the driver who had picked me up, joined halfway through, laughing easily and making the room feel lighter. It struck me then that despite the money and size of this place, everyone ate together. The staff weren't invisible, weren't treated like furniture. Jonathan asked about Ryan's repairs on the greenhouse, about Jason's upcoming trip to Burlington, even about Maggie's new baking experiment. There was no hierarchy at the table, only family or something close to it. And yet, I noticed Brittany watching Jonathan, not just glancing, but watching, like she was waiting for him to notice her in return. He didn't. If anything, he seemed unaware, focused instead on asking me questions about my credentials, my experience with spectrum disorders, and whether I'd ever done full live-in work before. When dinner ended, Jonathan rose and said, "Claire, I'd like you to meet Sophie now. If you're not too tired." I wasn't. Even if I had been, I wouldn't have admitted it. We walked down a quiet hall lined with bookshelves and family photographs. I slowed at one picture of Sophie as a toddler, golden hair in messy curls, blue eyes wide as she held what looked like a toy giraffe. She had been beautiful then, and from what Jonathan had said, she still was, just locked inside herself now. He knocked softly on a door before opening it. "Sophie, I'd like you to meet someone." The room was dim, curtains drawn, the air faintly scented with antiseptic and lavender. Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, thin shoulders hunched, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. She didn't look up. "Sophie," Jonathan said gently, "this is Claire. She'll be staying with us for a while, helping out." Her only response was a small nod, if you could call it that. Jonathan glanced at me with an apologetic look, then back at her. "Claire's here to make things easier for you, just like Maggie does." "Okay." Another barely there nod. Jonathan touched my arm lightly, guiding me back out. "Don't take it personally," he said once we were in the hall again. "She doesn't connect easily. It's part of everything she's dealing with." "I understand," I said quietly. And I did. Children like Sophie didn't push people away out of cruelty. They did it because life had already pushed them too hard. As I lay in bed later that night, listening to the quiet hum of the heating system, I thought about Sophie, about her pale face and silent nod. I thought about Jonathan, carrying so much weight he barely let himself breathe. And I thought about me, about why I'd said yes so quickly, why I'd packed up everything I owned for a job that might break me. But somewhere inside, maybe for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope. The next morning, Jonathan asked me to meet him in his study before I started the day with Sophie. He was already there when I walked in, leaning against the edge of his desk, hands clasped loosely in front of him. The light from the tall windows cut across his face, making the lines around his eyes seem sharper, older than his years. "Claire," he said, motioning for me to sit, "before you settle in, I need to tell you about Sophie. Not the clinical file, the truth." I nodded, folding my hands in my lap, bracing myself for the kind of story that doesn't come with easy endings. "She was our miracle baby," Jonathan began quietly. "My wife, Catherine, and I tried for years to have a second child. We already had Daniel, but she wanted a little girl so badly. When she finally got pregnant, it should have been the happiest time of our lives, but it wasn't." He paused, his jaw tight. The pregnancy was hard. Catherine had a heart condition that worsened under the strain, but she wouldn't terminate. She wanted Sophie, said she'd fight for her. His voice lowered. She gave birth and never came home. Heart failure. 1 week after Sophie was born, I buried my wife. The room went so still that I could hear the faint tick of the old grandfather clock in the hall. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Jonathan continued. Sophie was fragile from the start. We later learned she had a rare autoimmune disorder. Her body attacks itself, Claire, like it can't tell friend from foe. It leaves her tired, weak, and vulnerable to even simple colds. And then, as she grew, there was more. She wasn't engaging, wasn't looking at us, wasn't responding to her name. By the time she was 3, the doctors diagnosed her with Asperger's syndrome. She's brilliant in some ways, but the world is overwhelming for her. He walked to the window, staring out at the frost-tipped trees. For a while, it was manageable. She responded to structured therapy, to routines. She even smiled sometimes. But when puberty hit, her health nosedived. She barely speaks now. She hasn't smiled in over 2 years. And the truth is, I'm losing her, piece by piece, day by day. There was so much weight in his words that I almost felt it press against my chest. Jonathan, I said softly, I can't promise to fix that. I don't have magic. He turned, meeting my eyes. I don't want magic. I just want someone who won't give up on her. Someone who can give her a reason, however small, to want to stay connected. His hands tightened into fists and then released. We've tried everything else. You're my last hope before his voice trailed off, heavy with the unsaid. I understood what he wasn't saying. Before he accepts there's nothing left to be done. What about school? I asked, gently redirecting. Friends. He shook his head. We pulled her out of school 2 years ago. Too many germs, too many meltdowns. She does online tutoring now. As for friends, she hasn't had one since she was 8. The last girl who tried stopped coming around when Sophie couldn't keep up with social cues. Kids can be cruel, even when they don't mean to be. His shoulders dropped as though carrying too many winters. And I can't be both father and therapist anymore. She needs someone who knows what they're doing, someone who can stay steady when she shuts down. I thought about Sophie's room the night before, the closed curtains and the way she clutched her sweater like it was armor. I thought about that silent nod when I introduced myself. And I thought about the little girl in the photo, smiling at a stuffed giraffe like the world was simple and safe. I can stay steady, I said quietly. That I can promise. Jonathan's expression softened, something like relief flickering behind his eyes. Thank you. Just be patient with her. She might push you away at first. She pushes everyone away. I know the feeling, I said before I could stop myself. He glanced at me, curiosity in his eyes, but didn't press. Instead, he handed me a binder, a thick file of Sophie's routines, medications, therapy notes. Read this when you can. And one more thing. Sophie has never really connected with anyone outside the family. If she does even a little, let me know. That would mean more than you can imagine. I stood, holding the binder tight against my chest. I'll do my best. He gave a single nod. That's all I ask. When I left his study, I paused in the hallway, leaning against the wall. This wasn't just a job. It was a man's last desperate hope and a girl's fragile world. And for the first time in years, I felt my own walls crack, just a little, as if some part of me, long buried and bruised, whispered, "Don't let them down." The first morning I officially began felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't the house, it was peaceful, quiet, wrapped in that soft smell of fresh wood and coffee, but the weight of what Jonathan had told me. I wasn't just a caretaker here. I was stepping into a life already strain thin, a life where one wrong move could push a girl even further into her shell. I knocked gently on Sophie's door before opening it just a sliver. "Good morning, Sophie. May I come in?" My voice was calm, almost whispered, the way you'd talk to a bird perched on your hand, afraid it might fly away if you breathed too hard. She was sitting on the edge of her bed again, legs curled under her, arms wrapped around a pillow. Her pale hair fell over her face as she kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "I thought we could have breakfast together," I said softly, stepping inside. "You don't have to say anything. Just sit with me if you'd like." There was no response, just that silence I would come to know well, thick and unmoving. But I didn't retreat. Instead, I sat on the floor, not too close, and talked about small things, the frost on the windows, how Maggie's scones smelled like cinnamon, how my old apartment never had mornings this quiet. For 20 minutes, she didn't move. Then, without looking at me, she stood, walked past me, and left for the kitchen. It wasn't much, but it was something. Breakfast was quiet. Jonathan kissed Sophie's head when she sat, but she didn't react. Maggie filled our plates and gave me a look that said, "Don't worry, it's like this most days." Brittany walked in, looking polished even in a simple uniform, and shot me a glance over her coffee mug. "So, how's day one?" she asked, her tone just a bit too sweet. I smiled faintly. "It's just starting." She tilted her head, studying me the way someone studies competition. "You'll see. Sophie's particular. Not everyone lasts here." Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her, a silent warning, but she just shrugged and walked out. The tension she left behind lingered like static. After breakfast, I followed Sophie back to her room, keeping a respectful distance. She curled up in a chair by the window, knees to her chest, looking out at the trees. "You like the view?" I asked gently. "I do too. I used to live in the city. Lots of concrete, lots of noise. This is different. It feels like you can actually hear yourself think." Still no response. But I kept talking, not to fill the silence, but to keep my voice familiar, safe. Over the next few days, I built a routine. I read aloud while she sketched quietly in her notebook. I hummed soft tunes while adjusting her room, opening the curtains just a bit more each morning. Sometimes she would leave the room when I entered, but other times she would simply stay, silent but present. And in this line of work, presence is progress. Evenings were trickier. Sophie's autoimmune condition often left her exhausted by late afternoon, which meant irritability, sometimes even tears she couldn't explain. When that happened, I sat with her, calm and steady, reminding myself that emotions weren't the enemy here. They were the doorway, if you stayed long enough to understand them. Jonathan watched quietly from the background, most nights, his expression unreadable. But once, as I passed him in the hall, he murmured, "You're patient. That matters." It was the closest thing to approval I'd heard from him yet. But it wasn't all quiet progress. Brittany's presence was a constant friction. She never said anything overt, but her glances were sharp, like she was waiting for me to trip. One evening, she accidentally mentioned in front of Sophie that most caretakers don't last more than a month. Sophie had stiffened, pulling her blanket tighter, and I felt something in me snap, not anger exactly, but a determination to prove Brittany wrong. The hardest moment came on the 5th day. I had brought in a small box of paints, hoping Sophie might be interested. She ignored me completely at first, but then when I tried to place the box near her chair, she lashed out, not violently, but enough to knock the paints to the floor. Her breath came fast, almost panicked, and I froze, lowering myself to her eye level. "It's okay, Sophie. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to upset you. I'll put them away." For a long second, I thought she might scream. Instead, she curled into herself, whispering something I barely caught. "Don't change things." My chest tightened. "Okay," I whispered back. "No changes unless you say so." It took half an hour, but eventually she uncurled herself enough to let me pick up the paints and place them back in the box, sealing it shut. She watched me, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. That night, as I lay in bed, exhaustion heavy in my bones, I thought about how much work lay ahead. People outside this field often think progress is a breakthrough moment, a magical transformation. But the truth is, progress is built on tiny moments, a shared breakfast, a silent nod, a whispered request not to change things. And I decided right then I wasn't going anywhere. Not for Brittany, not for fear, not even for my own doubts. Sophie deserved someone who stayed, and for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be that person. By the second week, I could feel Sophie's walls. Not just see them, but feel them, invisible barriers built carefully over years of retreat. She rarely spoke, rarely looked at me directly, but she listened. I knew she did because when I told small stories from my childhood, about my foster homes, about the feeling of being different, her hands would still, her breathing slow. It was subtle, but I'd been in this field long enough to recognize when someone was listening even if they couldn't respond. Still, something was missing. Connection needs an anchor, and sometimes when words fail, that anchor has to be something or someone else entirely. One evening, as I sat with Jonathan in the kitchen reviewing Sophie's therapy notes, I said, "Have you ever thought about a therapy animal? A dog specifically. It could help her regulate stress and give her a companion she doesn't feel pressured by." Jonathan looked doubtful. "A dog? We've never had pets. I'm not sure how she'd react to unpredictability." I smiled faintly. That's the thing about therapy dogs. They're trained for calmness, for routines. I know someone at a rescue center who works with Newfoundland dogs. They're big, gentle, almost like living stuffed animals. I think it might help. He considered it, eyes narrowing slightly. "If you think it's worth trying, do it. Just don't push her too hard." The next morning, I made a call to an old colleague. By Friday, we had a visitor, a 2-year-old Newfoundland named Timothy, or Tim for short. He was enormous, black fur shining like silk, and eyes so soft they seemed to absorb the world rather than stare at it. When I led him into Sophie's room, she froze. Her eyes darted to me, then to Tim, then back to me. "He's friendly," I said gently. "Do you want me to take him out?" For a moment, I thought she might scream, the way she had with the paints. Instead, she whispered something so soft I barely caught it. "He can stay?" Tim took one slow step forward, then another, until he sat down right at Sophie's feet. He didn't move, didn't lick, didn't demand. He just sat and waited. Sophie's hands trembled, hovering inches above his fur, until finally, slowly, she touched him. Just once, and then again, longer this time. Her eyes flicked up at me for the briefest second, blue and unsure. And in that moment, I saw it. A spark. Not joy, not yet, but curiosity. Over the next few days, Tim became part of our routine. He lay beside Sophie while she sketched, followed her to the kitchen, even curled at the foot of her bed at night. And Sophie changed. Slightly, but enough to make my chest ache with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She started whispering to him when she thought no one was listening. Short phrases like, "Good boy," or "Stay." One morning, I found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, brushing his coat with a focus so intense she didn't notice me in the doorway. When she finally did, she blinked at me and said quietly, "He likes it." I nearly froze. It was the longest sentence she'd spoken to me. I smiled. "He does. And he likes you." Her lips twitched, almost a smile, before she bent back to brushing. That night, Jonathan stopped me in the hall. "She told me about Tim," he said, voice rough. "She hasn't voluntarily shared anything with me in years." "Thank you, Claire." I shook my head. Thanked him. He's the one doing the work. But privately, I knew this was a turning point. Not just for Sophie, but for me. Because for the first time, I felt like maybe I belonged here. Tim's arrival didn't just change Sophie. It changed the energy in the entire house. She still didn't smile often, still barely spoke. But she started following Tim into rooms she'd avoided before, the kitchen, the greenhouse, even the back porch on warmer afternoons. I could see it in Jonathan's eyes whenever he noticed her movement, like he was afraid to hope but couldn't stop himself. And somewhere in the middle of it all, I started to change too. I found myself lingering in the kitchen after dinner, listening to Maggie hum old Irish lullabies while she washed dishes. I joined Jason for morning coffee runs when I had a spare 10 minutes. And Ryan, quiet, steady Ryan, began stopping by to check on Tim, though I suspected he was also checking on me. One afternoon, as I sat on the back steps watching Sophie throw a ball gently for Tim, Ryan leaned against the porch railing. "She's different with the dog," he said softly. I nodded. "She's different with everything lately. Tim's a bridge." Ryan smiled faintly, his eyes kind. "You're part of that too, you know." I looked down at my hands, uncomfortable with praise. "I'm just here, trying not to mess it up." "You're doing more than that," he said. Then, after a pause, "You like it here?" The question caught me off guard. "Yeah, I do. More than I expected." Ryan's expression softened in a way that made my chest tighten. There was no judgment, no pity, just understanding. For someone like me, who had spent years building walls, that kind of acceptance was unfamiliar and healing. A week later, my best friend back in Boston invited me to her farewell party. She was moving to Seattle for work. Jonathan surprised me by saying, "Go. We'll manage for a day. You deserve it." So I went. For the first time in weeks, I stepped back into the noisy, crowded city. It was strange how quickly I realized I didn't miss it. But what I didn't expect was running into him. Vlad, the man I once called my boyfriend, who turned out to be nothing more than a bet to him and his friends. He grinned when he saw me, the kind of grin that makes your stomach twist. "Claire Donovan, wow. Heard you finally ran off to hide somewhere." "Figures." I stiffened, ready to leave, but he blocked my path. "Still playing savior? Still thinking you can fix broken things? What's the charity case this time?" For a moment, I froze, old shame rising like a tide. Then, before I could respond, a voice behind me said, "Back off." Ryan. I don't even know how he happened to be there. Later, he told me he had a supply run in the city. But in that moment, all I knew was relief. Vlad muttered something under his breath and walked away, clearly deciding Ryan wasn't worth the fight. "You okay?" Ryan asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, though my throat tightened. "Yeah, just ghosts I didn't expect to see." He studied me for a moment. "You don't owe them anything, especially not your silence." Something about those words broke through the old fear I'd carried for years. "Thank you, Ryan," I whispered. The rest of the night was quiet. Ryan didn't push me to talk about it, didn't pry. He just stayed nearby, a steady presence. The kind of presence I didn't know I needed until then. When we returned to Vermont the next day, Sophie surprised me by waiting near the door, Tim at her side. "You came back," she said softly, eyes on the floor but voice clear. "Yes," I said, smiling. "I promised I would." Her lips moved, hesitant, almost trembling, and for the first time, she smiled. A small one, quick and fleeting, but it was there. Jonathan, standing behind her, froze. His hand gripped the doorway as if he couldn't believe what he'd just seen. For a second, no one spoke, until Maggie whispered from the kitchen, "Well, I'll be." And just like that, everything shifted. It wasn't full healing, not yet, but it was the beginning. When we got back to the Reeves estate, the sky was a soft gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Vermont winters come quietly at first, like the world is holding its breath. That evening felt like that, quiet, fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it. Sophie was different now. That small smile she'd given me at the door kept echoing in my mind, like an unexpected melody I didn't know I'd been waiting for. She didn't retreat to her room that night. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with Tim curled at her feet, sketching while Maggie made soup. Jonathan watched her from the doorway, hands in his pockets, a strange look on his face. Hope, fear, something unnameable. He glanced at me. "What did you do out there?" "Nothing magical," I said softly. "I just came back like I promised." He exhaled slowly and nodded. Sometimes that's all it takes. The days after that were different. Sophie still had her moments, long silences, days when fatigue wrapped around her like a fog, But there was a shift. She sought me out now, even if only to sit in the same room. Sometimes she'd ask simple questions about Tim, or about how the snowplows worked on the long driveway. Once, she surprised me by asking about my favorite color, and when I said green, she handed me a sketch of maple leaves, each one carefully shaded in deep, rich emerald. Jonathan noticed too. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, he said quietly, "You've done more in 3 weeks than I managed in 3 years." I shook my head. It's not me. It's time and trust. And Tim, of course. He smiled faintly, rubbing the back of his neck. I keep thinking about something my wife used to say. She said, people aren't puzzles to be solved, they're gardens to be tended. You've done that here. His words stuck with me, partly because I'd never thought of myself as someone who tended to anything. I'd always been running, surviving, patching my own broken places. But now, maybe I was planting something too. Ryan and I grew closer after that night in Boston. We didn't talk about Vlad or what had happened. We didn't need to. Instead, he showed up on small errands, fixing a loose shutter here, checking on Tim's new kennel there. Sometimes he'd just sit on the back porch with me, both of us sipping coffee in the cold, saying nothing. And in those silences, I felt something rare, safe. One evening, Sophie surprised me by joining us on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, Tim's massive head resting on her lap. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at the falling snow. Then, out of nowhere, she said softly, "Do you ever feel like you don't belong anywhere?" Her words pierced me because, yes, that had been my entire life. I used to feel that way a lot, I admitted, like I was always on the outside looking in. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes searching. What changed? I took a deep breath. I found people who didn't make me feel like I had to earn my place. They just accepted me, even when I thought I didn't deserve it. Sophie was quiet for a long time, then whispered, "I want that." "You have it, Sophie," I said, leaning forward. "Right here, right now. This house, your dad, Maggie, Ryan, Tim, and me. We're not going anywhere." Her fingers curled into Tim's fur, and for the second time in a week, I saw her smile. It was small, but it reached her eyes this time, and Jonathan, who had stepped onto the porch behind us, turned away quickly, blinking hard. Later that night, Jonathan found me in the hallway. "You've given her something I didn't think we'd ever get back," he said, his voice rough. "Hope." I hesitated, because hope was something I wasn't used to giving. "She's the one choosing it, Jonathan. I'm just holding space for her to do it." He nodded, then said something that startled me. "Claire, after these 3 months, if you want to stay longer, there will always be a place for you here." The offer hit me harder than I expected. I'd always been temporary everywhere I went. Temporary apartments, temporary jobs, temporary relationships. And now, here was someone offering permanence. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Sophie's smile, Jonathan's offer, and the quiet way Ryan's presence steadied me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running. I felt like I was home. By the time December arrived, the world outside had turned white and silent. Vermont winters have a way of slowing everything down, forcing you to sit with whatever life has placed in your hands. For me, it was Sophie, and this unexpected feeling that I was no longer an outsider in someone else's story. The Reeves house glowed that winter. Not because of decorations, though Maggie did put up a wreath and a tree by the window, but because there was life again. Sophie came out of her room more often, sketchbook in hand, Tim following close behind like a shadow. She even started leaving little notes on the kitchen counter. For Maggie, thanks for the soup. Or for Claire, Tim needs a new brush. They were small things, but Jonathan kept every one of them, tucking them into a drawer like treasures. On Christmas Eve, Jonathan asked if I'd join the family dinner. "We usually keep it small," he said, "just us, Maggie and Ryan, but you're part of us now." The word sank deep. Part of us now. Dinner was simple but warm. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, Maggie's famous apple pie. Ryan sat across from me, giving one of his quiet smiles whenever our eyes met. Jonathan poured a glass of wine for each adult, then raised his glass. To family, he said, the one we're born with and the one we choose. Sophie looked at me when he said that, then whispered, to family, almost too soft to hear. Jonathan froze mid-sip, eyes bright, and I realized it might have been the first time she'd joined in a toast. After dinner, we gathered in the living room by the tree. Snow fell outside, heavy and soft, and the fire crackled low. Sophie sat cross-legged on the rug. Tim curled around her like a giant blanket. Then, quietly, she got up and walked toward me, something hidden behind her back. "This is for you," she said, handing me a small envelope. Inside was a sketch, me sitting by her window reading, Tim sprawled at my feet, and her own figure tucked in the corner looking out. Across the bottom, in neat letters, she had written, "Thanks for staying." I couldn't speak. My throat closed, my eyes stung, and all I could do was pull her into a soft, careful hug. She stiffened at first, then slowly, hesitantly hugged me back. Jonathan turned away, pretending to stoke the fire, but I saw his hand brush his eyes. That night, as I tucked Sophie in, she whispered, "You'll still be here after?" "Yes," I said firmly, "as long as you want me to." Her small fingers curled around mine. "Okay." And then, for the third time in as many weeks, she smiled. Later, when the house was quiet, Jonathan found me in the kitchen. "You've done something I didn't think possible," he said, voice low and steady. "You've given me back my daughter." I shook my head. She did that herself. I just didn't leave. He studied me for a moment, then said softly, "That's exactly what she needed. Someone who doesn't leave." We stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind whip against the windows. Then he said something I didn't expect. "Claire, I meant what I said earlier. If you want to stay past your contract, this house is your home too. Permanently." The word home hit harder than I thought it would. I'd never really had one. Not a permanent one anyway. I thought about Sophie's sketch, about Ryan's steady presence, about the way Maggie laughed when she cooked and Jason's easy jokes. And for the first time in my life, the idea of staying didn't scare me. It felt right. I nodded slowly. "I'd like that. I'd like to stay." Jonathan smiled then, an expression that made him look younger, lighter. "Good. I'm glad to hear it." As I walked back to my room, I caught sight of Sophie asleep. Tim sprawled at her feet, her lips curled in the faintest smile. And I realized something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the fragile kind that feels like it will break with one wrong move, but the deep, steady kind that comes when you finally stop running. Sometimes healing isn't about grand gestures or miraculous changes. Sometimes it's about staying, showing up, choosing to hold someone's hand when the rest of the world lets go. That winter, in a house on a Vermont hill, surrounded by snow and silence and unexpected laughter, I finally found my place, my home, my family. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just helping Sophie heal. She was helping me too.